Thanks for turning out. This is a Sustainable Cliff / Planning Association event, if you will. You know, we want Sustainable Cliff Island wants the island to be sustainable, and property taxes are one of the biggest threats we all know. And I think I've been through 5 of these revaluations, starting in the 60s. It's never a happy thing. But one thing that I've always wanted to think about at times like this, it's a threat from the city, the big bad city in some ways, and a pretty good city in other ways to us. We always get complaints. We get, on one hand, we get services on the other, and so it's just what it is. And so one of the things I like to emphasize is that we maintain a workable relationship with City Hall. We have Sustainable Cliff has brought down the city manager and the city councilor, John Jennings and Belinda Ray, 2 years ago, I guess, before the virus, just so they could have a few hours, 2 or 3 hours on the island, get to see what it's about, sit down, have coffee and muffins and stuff, and they were very, very pleased, as opposed to what they might receive for a reception next Tuesday from unhappy people who want to yell at them about whatever the case, the complaint might be. And we did the same thing with the school superintendent, Javier Botana, and our District 1 school committee member, Mickey Bondo. And so the idea of those 2 visits, again, Bob and I did it one time, Cheryl and I did the other one, and so that they could just come down here and get a quiet understanding of what the island is like, and what the roads look like, you know, basically get a feel for the place. We're not Chablis, we're not Peaks, we're not Long, we're Cliff Island. And so we've been working hard to keep a good working relationship with the city. We'll see how that plays out next Tuesday when the city fathers and city mothers come out here for 45 minutes or something. Yeah. You know, they just want to get away with their lives. Basically, they want to get out of here before they're assassinated. Anyway, so trying to keep ahead of the curve. So revaluation, by law, this has to be done, and it's never a happy thing to contemplate, but it's a fact of life as a property owner. And so here we are, and so to either dampen the sense of panic or to educate or however you want to look at it, we thought Sustainable Cliff Board thought it was important to get information out, facts and strategies. And so anyhow, so I know David Silk, Curtis Thaxter, and he is a municipal lawyer among many other things, and so he's come out here to try and explain what we're facing, what he's learned from other situations and so forth. So I won't try to do your whole talk for you, just what you do. So David Silk, thank you.
Yeah, thanks Roger, thanks for inviting me out. And for everybody who has a pad and a pencil and pen, write down whatever you want, but I have a handout here which will somewhat summarize what I'm going to speak to you about. And so I'll give that to you at the end of the class, because I realize that if I give it to you now, you won't listen to a word I say. I'm reading this, and then you're going to say, what did he say? So I will give this to you at the end. But I'm not going to, it's not a script for me, but it gives you some basic information that I'll be covering when I give you my little bit of talk here. And let me just say a little bit about myself. I've been a resident of Portland since 1981. You're going to learn that there's a board called the Board of Assessment Review in Portland, which is the board comprised of 3 people. And when someone doesn't like their tax valuation and they appeal formally to the assessor and it's denied, in Portland, you get the right to present your case to the Board of Assessment Review. I was on the Board of Assessment Review from 1988 to 2003. So I was on that board for 15 years, and that math may be right. I was on it during the, Roger mentioned he's been here for 5 revals. I've been here for at least 3, and in 89, 90 there was a reval that hit the islands very hard, and I was a board member on that 3-person board hearing appeals from taxpayers coming in and saying my valuation is too high. So I have that experience. In addition, I've been serving on the Portland Planning Board. This is now probably my 19th year on the Portland Planning Board. So I have the advantage of being someone who listens to people, listens to what, arguments, or why it should be this, why it should be that, and seeing how fellow board members process and utilize information, what works, what doesn't work. In addition, I serve on the Cumberland County Board of Assessment Review right now, and that is a board for communities in Cumberland County that do not have a Board of Assessment Review. They come to us from Casco, from Raymond, from Harrison, from a lot of the more rural Cumberland County towns, and I sit on that board, and the one of the members of that board is also a member of the Portland Board of Assessment Review. So I have a sense. I'm not a judge or anything like that, and everybody who's a board member brings their own history and their own view of the world to these things, but I've been in the position where taxpayers have come and given information to the board and had to decide whether there's abatement is warranted, okay? So I have that experience. In addition, for the last 35 years, I've represented taxpayers, primarily commercial industrial, because residential taxpayers, you'll hear from me, it's hard to win an abatement appeal. And for commercial industrial property owners, there's an independent body that you can go to. You essentially have a trial. And I've represented both municipalities. I just won a case in the Maine Supreme Court a month ago for the town of Madison, dealing with the Madison paper mill. And I've represented taxpayers for 35 years. So it doesn't mean anything I say is gospel. It's just my view of the world. And so I just share that with you. And I've represented over time, groups of people, and down in Wells Beach at one point, out on Raymond Neck at one point, out different places that have been hit and had questions about revaluations. In those communities, it was more of a partial revaluation, where their valuations went up and everybody stayed the same, which raises a whole different host of issues that's not before you. So what I want to try to do today, leave some time at the end for some questions, but really 3 things, and I'm going to assume you don't know that much. Some of you may know more than others. The Portland Assessor's website has a lot of good information on it, and if you go there, you'll see very good information about process, about questions. It doesn't tell you whether you're overvalued or not, but there's information at the Portland. You go to City of Portland, click under Government, click under Assessor, click under Revaluation. There's some good information there. So you've got your estimated valuation. It came in. You got it. I assume you either looked it up online or you got it in the mail, and you open it up the envelope and say, "Well, you've got to be kidding me." And then you figure out, okay, what's the mill rate going to be? Because we all know there's 2 things that drive the city's budget. There's valuation and the tax rate, the effective tax rate. And if you followed this at all, you know that the Portland effective tax rate for FY22, or FY21, the fiscal year that just ended, was about 2331, and it's going to go down to 1349. So when you look to see, am I coming out ahead or am I coming out behind, the first thing you need to do is say, okay, using a mill rate of 1349 with this new valuation, are my taxes going to be the same, significantly higher, or significantly lower? So if you haven't done that exercise, you should. That would probably be the first thing I did. I live in Portland. I live over in Stroudwater. I got the envelope. I opened it up. I said, "Ooh, And then I said, okay, $13.49. Hey, I'm actually saving money. So, not saving, my tax burden is less. So it's important to do that. And the number is 13, it's on my handout. So if you haven't done that, and the way you do it is you take your valuation, divide it by 1,000, and then multiply it by the new rate. That's how you come up with your effective tax rate. So that's the first thing you do. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're paying equal or less in terms of taxes, you should still do what I suggest you do. But it's not as probably urgent as some of the folks who really see their valuation and their effective tax rate going up significantly, because you're paying more money and it's expensive. So that's the first thing to do. The second thing is with the revaluation. The city hired a revaluation company, so they've spent 2 years doing a lot of things. They've been gathering sales information, sales of vacant land, sales of improved lands, residential properties, island, non-island, waterfront, non-waterfront, western view, easterly view, whatever. And they've also been conducting inspections of properties. Now, they may not have actually come by your property when you've been there. They may not have come by because of COVID. They probably have not been going in anybody's house. And so the second thing you need to do, which is why I handed this out, is review the information the city has for your property and see if it's accurate. Because if it's not accurate, it's very easy to get it fixed. The city, in my experience, if you can show that, hey, this has me with 2 full bathrooms, I only have 1 full bath and I've got a toilet that's the size of a closet, you shouldn't be valuing me based on 2 full bathrooms. Okay, and I'll tell you how that gets built into the valuation. And so what I've handed you, Roger was kind enough to give me permission to take his house at 165 South Road. If you go to the city's website and you go to the assessor, you go to the revaluation page, and there's on the left-hand side, it's something that says property lookup. It brings up, you type in your name, and assuming you don't have a common name like Bill Smith or something, but your property will come up. And there'll be on the left-hand side 6 or 7 items you can click on. And you'll get this. And what this is, on the very first page, it says, you know, who the owner is, the type of living unit, the size of the lot. You know, if you look at it and it says you've got 8 acres and you only live on a half-acre parcel, there's a problem. Yeah. And it tells you what kind of utilities are there, well and septic. If it has something there that's different than what's there, that should be corrected. And I'm not going to walk through it all, but on the back of the second page are things where these get, the way they build up a building value as part of mass appraisal is they have a big manual. Well, it used to be a manual, now it's a computer program, by Marshall and Swift. So they try to capture what your property has, and they replicate what it would cost to build today, and then they depreciate it based on how old the improvements are. That's a very gross generalization. But a house that has 2 full bathrooms is worth more in this model than a house, all things being equal, than 1 full bathroom. A house with 5 bedrooms is worth more than a house with 3 bedrooms. A house with a full attic is worth more than a house with not a full attic. A house with a full basement is worth more. A house that's insulated and year-round is worth more on this model than a house that's not. And so the way your value is being arrived at is in part based on a land value and a building value. And if the inputs they're using to generate a building value are incorrect, you need to bring that to their attention. And you don't have to do that in the context of a hearing either. You can just pick up the phone and call the city and say, listen, you know who you are, what's going on, and say, listen, I'm looking at the property rate card as part of the revaluation, and there's some things there that I don't think are right. And they'll say, okay, tell me. My secretary lives in South Portland. They went, just as you know, South Portland went through a reval. They had her with a full bathroom in the basement. And she came to me and said, geez, I just have a little I have a toilet, I don't have a full bath. I said, call them. She called, and they took off 25 grand. You know, values in South Portland are very, very high. So, you know, but the point is, it was a no-brainer. And so, in addition, the first thing you do is you check and see how you're going to make out based on the new mill rate. Second thing you want to do is go to the city's website and review this information. So it also has a sketch. You know, they may have you with a huge deck and you don't have a deck. It may have you with a building that's not accurately reflected there in terms of the dimensions of the building. Again, that's data that all goes into the program to generate a building value. All right? So that's the second step. All right? So if you haven't done that, you should do that. Everybody should do it and just see. All right? The third step is more of a little bit more of a difficult step, but it's a step that's being raised now. I talked to Roger a little bit, and Roger told me that there's been some people have gone to informal hearings already. And the way that the city or the reval company develops a value anywhere in the city is they, in addition to the building and the improvements and having the data and the computer that generates a number, they come up with what's a raw land value. So hypothetically, they're trying to determine what your land value would be if there were no improvements, and then they take what's there, put it in the computer, and come up with a building value. They add them together, and when you get your tax bill, you see there's a land value and a building value. And you know, sometimes people say, I don't have a problem with building value. You know, my camp, my house, cottage, whatever, they got 150, 200. You know, for Roger, on this parcel, you know, they got a building value went from 80,000 to 205. But you know, Roger may say, you know, geez, you know, if I had to build it today or whatever, you know, that seems to make sense. But the land value, where are they getting the land value of 384,000? That's crazy. I'm not saying now that's true, but it becomes a different exercise for the land value because you can't check anything. You can't check how they came up with it on the records you're looking at. You can check to see what dimensions they have for your house, but you can't check where they came up with 384. And I'll tell you how they come up with a land value. They look back 3 years or so for vacant land sales. Vacant. So somebody's selling a 2-acre parcel on the market. It has to be on the market, listed with a broker. And they look all around the city for vacant land sales. And so Cliff Island in the last 3 years, there may not be any vacant land sales. I mean, Roger told me there may have been a transfer to a conservation trust, but probably that sale wasn't on the market. You know, transfers between son, you know, father to son, mother to daughter, cousin to cousin, those are not considered arm's length sales because they're between family members. You know, what they're looking for are foreclosure sales aren't arm's length sales. They're looking for sales in which something was listed. You'd see it advertised, not in the paper anymore, but on, you know, wherever you go look for your listings. It's subject to people to, you know, and so they look all over the city. All right, so they come up with a pool of land sales. And then they segregate them, and then they say, okay, what land sales are waterfront? What land sales are not? What land sales have water views? What land sales do not? Assuming they can find them. And then they come up with kind of a unit average value on a per, I don't know if they're using a half acre or acre or buildable lot. Whatever they use a basic number. And then they begin adjusting it. And they adjust it island, non-island. Cliff Island versus Peaks Island versus Great Diamond versus Little Diamond. And, you know, where I am, Stroudwater versus the Eastern Prom versus Back Cove versus the Western Prom. And then they even adjust it even more based on the characteristics of the neighborhood the property is located. And it's really hard to get the data on what they're doing for the adjustments on the land sales to say this mass gathering of land values with all these adjustments is supposed to indicate that if your property sold without any improvements on it, just sold vacant land, that's how much someone would pay for the land. And so, for Roger's case, at 165 South Road, right? They are saying, roughly, if Roger didn't have a house on it, and as of April 1, 2021, it was on the market, exposed, etc., it would sell for, about $390,000. That's what they're saying for that lot, $390,000. They adjust it for size too. If you've got a buildable lot, you've got some excess land, there's a factor they'll add into it as well. You know, if it has a well and a septic, but they'll adjust that for well. If is it buildable, non-buildable, they'll adjust that as well. But that's how they come up with the land value. And so many of you have already just acknowledged there's been no land sales on Cliff. And I don't know, I haven't done any research on this, but Roger told me on the ride over, as far as he knows, there haven't been any raw vacant land sales the last 3 years. So when they're trying to come up with a land value for all your properties on this island, they have to look at a broader market. And they're looking at probably not only land sales in the city, but they're looking at, okay, have there been land sales, vacant land sales on Peaks? And have there been vacant land sales on Great Diamond or Little Diamond in the last 3 years or so? And if so, what have they been selling for? And that would give them some data in terms of, okay, what's land sales on islands in general versus the mainland? Because we all know island is a different, it's different than the mainland. You dependent upon ferries or boats to get here. You have a totally different dynamic. And then the question becomes, all right, what about the desirability or the market influences on buying land if it was available on Cliff versus Peaks? All right, how many commuters are you getting attracting to Cliff? You'd like to attract more, perhaps, to sustain the community. But how many more? If you have a lot that's buildable on Peaks, you're going to have that much greater interest because it's that much closer to Portland. You've got sewer, you've got water, you've got a different access to schools, perhaps for jobs. Then Great Diamond, Little Diamond, and then Cliff. And so, again, I haven't looked at any of the underlying data, but Roger mentioned to me that one of the common themes and something that the city is looking at because of the questions that have been raised by some of you, here or not here, going through the informal process to date, is where you're coming up with that land value. If it's based on what happens on Peaks, you're comparing apples to oranges. We're not Peaks. And so that's another piece to look at during the revaluation process. And it's easier to get adjustments as a result of this revaluation process because the assessor knows that this mass appraisal process is not perfect. It's a great mass process, and when you trickle down to individual properties or individual communities, there's some adjustments that could have been not made correctly. And so, long story short, in addition to checking on your building value, which is easy to do, because you can go to the website and see what they have and compare it. The land value is, I think there's information being a little bit more gathered by some of the folks going to the hearings, but that's something to look at. And it's an avenue where if they weren't, and again, any appraiser will tell you, they're just giving you an opinion of market value. It's an opinion. It's not science. I've had appraisers on the stand all the time. This is just your opinion. Right, you're not a scientist. No, I could be off. And in the main law says from an assessing perspective, if the assessor is within 10% of what's considered market value, it's good. So if you've got $1 million property and you think it's only worth $930, and the assessor's got it at $1 million, and you show it's worth $930, most likely you're not gonna win because it's within 10%. It's not required to get it exactly right. It just wouldn't be feasible for any assessor to have to go down to the level of having to get it that close to reflect market value. So those are the things that you can do right now while the city is still making adjustments. They're making adjustments. They're looking to see what kind of information taxpayers are presenting to them. And Portland, almost better than any community in Maine, the assessor's office in Portland, I found listens. They're not defensive. They don't have any. If they feel that an adjustment's warranted, they'll do it. Some smaller communities, that doesn't happen because it means the assessor is admitting that he or she was wrong, and that you don't have that in Portland. You've got a pretty good staff in Portland. They've got a pretty good group of people who are trying to get it right, and and you should remember that if you're dealing with the folks at the city, they're just trying to get it right, and you have to separate out unhappiness with a rising value versus whether it's within the ballpark or not. Okay, and if you go in there with an approach taking no prisoners, you're not going to get very far. You can still go in and be you can go in there with information and be firm and have questions. That's fine, but there's a fine line there in terms of how you can work with City Hall, and I see that on the planning board. When applicants come and how they present what they'd like to have happen.
So David, while you're on, not to interrupt, you know what you're doing, but we've all seen this admission from Tyler Technologies that they're going to look at all of them in the other ones. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I will. So, Roger, on the land value, the assessor has asked, these are my words, not the assessor's words, but because of the lack of land sales on Cliff Island, and the feedback that the assessor's office is receiving about people concerned about their valuations, and people are saying, I assume, this doesn't reflect values on Cliff Island. This isn't, we're way out. We're different than a lot of other people. That's caused the assessor to go back to Tyler Technologies, which is the company that did the reval, and look to see what exactly was driving the factoring they were using. Remember I talked about you take a basic land value, generic, and you adjust it for what was the factors they were using for Cliff versus, was it the same as Peaks? Was it the same as Great Diamond? Was it the same as Little Diamond? Leaving aside whether your property's waterfront, but just what's called the neighborhood factor. And the neighborhood factor would be, out here, wouldn't be Stroudwater versus Oakdale. It would be Cliff versus probably the harbor side of Peaks versus the far side of Peaks. They may be two separate neighborhoods, and they're looking at that, and because they're questioning whether they got it right, and so that's happening as we speak. And if that process continues, that means that they may reduce somewhat the land values across the board. So when you get your final tax bill, your valuation may be a little bit lower than what's there. I mean, that's just conjecture, but usually when they say we're looking at it, if there's a problem, I've never known the city, at least in the assessors in the city, just not to, they'll step up and fix it. That's not an issue for them. Yeah?
You keep on saying Peaks, but you don't say any of the diamonds. So when you speak of the tech group, that they will use Peaks for land value, but you never say diamond. Are they going to use Diamond Island or not?
I don't know.
Because they're part of Portland. Also, if you have an appraisal done for property that's being sold and you're a realtor, which I was for 35 years, they have to use the appraisal subject over on Chubig and Long. That's car wash, that's what they
Yeah,
do,
so-
because we're similar.
Yeah, let
Do
me,
they do that?
yeah, let me, I'm gonna talk about appraisals in a second.
Okay,
That's
good.
my next layer. So
Thank
what I was trying to do is,
Yeah, good.
hold on a second. What I was trying to do was do this in terms of 3 layers. One is, you get your tax bill, you look and see where you stand. The second is, you look to understand what the 2 components are, building and land. The third issue is overall valuation. All right, and if you go to a formal hearing, if you're in front of the Board of Assessment Review, they don't really typically care what the land value is or the building value is. They care what your overall value is and whether you're substantially overvalued. And typically, what they want to hear is some evidence of what your property is worth if you sold it compared to what it's assessed at. And so as this migrates through the system, it goes from a little bit more informality about you got my deck square footage wrong, or the land values as a computer entry adjustments were wrong. And if that doesn't get you where you want to be, and you still think you're overvalued, and when I say you're overvalued, you get your tax bill and it says, your new valuation at 100% is, in Roger's case, is $590,000. Now, Roger knows his house, that property. And again, you may not have a lot of land sales or property sales out here in Cliff, but the first question you have to ask, after you've done everything I said, you're going to go down the road and now talk about valuation, overall valuation. Is 590, is that in the ballpark? I may not like it, but is it in the ballpark? And if you think it is, okay. I mean, I know what values are in my neighborhood. When I got the bill, the estimate, I kind of said, geez, it went up. But I know what houses have been selling for, so I'm okay. I'm not gonna push it. But if you don't know, or you think it's too high, the next step is to get some sense of valuation. And in Maine, owners of property can testify, give opinions of value, but it's only as good as the substance of what they have uncovered as part of their due diligence. Typically, what people try to do is they try to get brokers to do kind of drive-by, so-called drive-by, opinions of value, or you get an appraisal. And if anybody who's done a refinance in the last 2 years, typically, the boards like to see appraisals as of the date of valuation, which is April 1 of 2021. So if you're talking to a broker or you're talking to an appraiser, you need to make sure that if they're giving you anything about what they think the value is, it should be around April 1. If you happen to do a refinance and it's April 30th, that's probably okay, and you had an appraisal done for the refinance. But if you bring an appraisal 2 years ago, it's got to be closer to April 1. And so that's would be the third step. And if you think that the real issue is they've miscalculated the land value versus some of the other islands, if you've got someone who's an appraiser or a broker, again, this goes to the broker saying, I've looked at some of the values in Cliff, they seem too high to me. These are values that should be more reflective of some of the other islands. It's not reflective of that. Any kind of information you can get like that, a letter from a broker, an appraiser, and appraisers are backed up because of the real estate market. It's going to take you 8 to 12 weeks to get an appraisal. It's going to cost anywhere between $500 and $1,000. I think they may be demanding more because. But again, if you really think you're overvalued, this reval number is going to be in play for 10 years. The city says they're going to do it every 5 years now. Maybe. But the point is, if you think you're overvalued, and let's say it's I should be at 750 versus 950. So that's 200,000. You do the math and you say, if I get it knocked down to 750, I'd save this much on taxes, and so is it worth if I pick that up over 5 years? Let's say I save $2,000 a year on taxes. 5 years, that's 10 grand. Well, maybe it's worth I spend $1,000 and get an appraisal. because I stand to gain $9,000 over 5 years, minus that cost. And, you know, if you end up, you know, with a good credible appraisal, you know, often the assessors will reduce the value, because normally what's going to happen is the appraiser is going to identify something about your property that didn't get captured in the mass appraisal process. You know, slope, distance from the dock, age of the roof, condition of the building. I mean, they'll pick that up. They also may give you an appraisal that says you're within 10%, in which case, you know, you can still submit it to the city and see if they'll lower it. I wouldn't hire a lawyer and go spend $2,000 to take it through the board of, you know, if you came to me with an appraisal that was within 10%, I'd tell you to go home. I mean, frankly, that's what I would do. So that's the third step, which is really, okay, I've gone through the building components. The land may not get adjusted somewhat. Hopefully it does, and that would probably be reflected on everyone on Cliffs Island. You don't get a right to do anything. All the hearings now are informal because they're not waiving any legal rights. Your legal rights to challenge the assessment don't begin to run until commitment happens. Commitment is when the city council votes to say, okay, tax collector, here's the mill rate, go out and collect the taxes, and according to the city's website, commitment's supposed to happen the week of September 7th, all right? And you've got 180, this is all in my little sheet, you've got 185 days from the date of commitment to file an abatement request with the assessor, 185 days, so it's roughly half a year. So if the and so you'll have time. You're going to mail out the final tax bills in September. You'll see what your land and building value is, and if all the informal hearing process and maybe adjustment island-wide, it still doesn't get you where you think you should be. You think you're substantially overvalued. That's the test. Substantially overvalued. You also hear the word manifestly wrong. That's what the court looks for. They say, is this assessment manifestly wrong? Manifestly means it jumps out at you. Manifestly, it's wrong, and that's the burden. It's a heavy burden on the taxpayer. The assessor does not have to prove anything in Maine assessing law. The assessor is presumed correct. They don't have to come in and show anything. I tell this all the time to people. The assessor could come in and say, you know what, I had a monkey throwing darts, and that's how I arrived at your value. And you say, that's crazy, you should give me your relief. The board's going to say, no. You still have to prove that the number the dart landed on is manifestly wrong. That's what it's like. And I've been there as an advocate, I've been there as an advocate for the town, I've been there as a board member. You, the taxpayer, have the burden to show it was manifestly wrong. So you have to come forward with evidence of that. So you've got 185 days, so if you're still not happy, then you need to reach out and get somebody or do your own homework. And it's harder on Cliff because, you know, in Stroudwater, you know, within a half mile of my house in the last 3 years has probably been 20 sales. I could, as a taxpayer, look at those sales, get them, and say, look, you know, look at these houses. This is what they sold for. You've got me way out of whack compared to what's sold for. The other thing you can do as well, which is more, you know, a turn on my neighbor type of an issue, which is, look, my house is much more inferior to my neighbor's house. My neighbor has, you know, they don't have any trees blocking their sunset. They've got a beautiful dock. They've got a nice lawn. You know, I don't have a view. I don't have everything, but you've got me valued the same as my neighbor. It's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. That's a situation where you're not saying you're overvalued. You're saying I'm not being treated consistently with the way my neighbors have been treated. And so in those instances, it's a hard argument to win on before a board because it's not really an overvaluation issue, it's really a situation where your neighbor's not valued correctly. You may be valued correctly, and your neighbor's the one who should be jacked up. And so, but it's sometimes it happens. And you know, people try to make the argument that vis-a-vis my neighbors, I'm not being assessed comparably. They have me up here, and I'm not up here, I'm down here. And you bring in pictures of the other properties, and you show what qualities they have that are better than the qualities at your house and your property, and you try to draw a distinction and say, I'm too high relative to my neighbor. So you can try that. That's a, you know, if you have good data, you put together, you know, a good, you know, little booklet that has the photos, that has the assessing records for the neighbors, and you can really, you can develop that as a factual story. You may get somewhere. But typically, when people come to the board, you know, they come with some evidence, and this is, you know, back in 89, 90, or even more recently, they come in either, you know, a letter from a broker, they come in with an appraisal, or they come in with some analysis that says I'm being overvalued. Just coming in and saying, I think I'm too high, I don't think they got it right, I think they're wrong. Again, they don't have to prove they're right, you have to prove that the value is too high. And so that would be the third step, which is you get the tax bill, final tax bill, you think you're well beyond 10%, okay? Well beyond 10% in terms of it being off. And then, you know, I mean, lawyers at that point, you know, lawyers need evidence. Lawyers need facts. I mean, you know, you don't have facts, you don't have evidence, it's not much a lawyer can do for you. So what I usually tell people when they call me, especially on the residential side, I said, you know, before you pay me any money, you know, I listen to what they have to say and see if there's something I can run with. But typically, I say the best thing to do, you know, if you think there's really something wrong, is get an appraisal, and then let's see what we can do with it, and make sure it's April 1. And I had a situation out in Raymond a few years ago in Raymond Neck, and I was in a room like this with a whole bunch of people, and they did a partial reval, and I just said, you know, before you pay me a lot of money, go out and get appraisals, even if it's from different appraisers, it's even better. And we did, we ended up having 10 appraisals done, you know, 2 by one person, 2 by another, and they were all coming in substantially lower than what the assessed value was. And so when I went and had a meeting with the assessor and the assessor's agent, I was able to say that the data that was, they did a reval. So the data they were using to make a neighborhood adjustment for this area of town wasn't valid. It wasn't correct because, look, and they didn't give us everything we wanted, but they gave us substantial abatement. But I had facts, I had evidence. And, you know, some appraisers are better than others, but they're clearly island appraisers that, you know, specialize on, and, you know, the city knows that those people, typically, if they've been in business for a while, they do a good job. So that would be the third piece. Unfortunately, if you go to the board, and so what happens is you go to the assessor, you got 185 days from commitment to file with the assessor. The assessor's got 60 days to act on it, all right? May ask for some more time, but assuming they have 60 days, if they don't act on it within 60 days, it's deemed denied. So you keep track of when you mailed it. If you mailed it January 1st, they have to act on it depending on whether it's a leap year, March 2nd, March 3rd. Then you've got 60 days from that date to file to the Board of Appeals, I mean the Board of Assessment Review. And they've got 60 days to act. And they will give, the assessor doesn't usually give you a hearing. You fill out an abatement request and you give the assessor information, but you don't typically have a hearing. You don't show up in front of the Board of Assessment Review. You know, the board sits right here, you sit here, the assessor sits here, then the board says, okay, taxpayer, what do you got? Tell us why you're overvalued, and you've got the floor. You've got 10, 20, 30 minutes. Here's my appraisal, here's this, here's that. And then they hear from the assessor, and they're gonna say, okay, what's up? And the assessor may say whatever they're gonna say. So it's like a mini trial. And then the board will apply the standard of proof that I told you and make a decision. That's kind of, you can appeal from a Board of Assessment review to the Superior Court, but at that level, you don't get a hearing. The only thing that the court system does at that point is say, did the board misapply the law? So the only real hearing, factual hearing you're going to get is in front of the Board of Assessment Review. And again, it's 3 citizens of Portland. They don't get paid. I'm on the planning board. I don't get paid. They're doing it as a civic, some sense of civic responsibility. Typically, they have people either with a legal or appraising or assessing background on the Board of Assessment Review. When I was on it, I had the assessor from Cape Elizabeth, and I had Jerry Daigle, Steve DeBias, who was back then an appraiser. And they knew their stuff. So they did a good job. But again, they know what the standard of proof is. And so unless you had something, something credible, you weren't going to get anywhere. And so that's why I say, if you get your tax bill in September and you really still think it's not right, my recommendation would be mindful of the clock, but my recommendation would be go out and get an appraisal and see what it shows. So that's kind of the overview, and I'm going to take questions. Before I do that, if you're really interested in trying to understand what's going on with how they came up with the land value for a cliff, it's not online. You can ask the assessor's office for it. You're going to get, pages and pages of kind of computer-generated factors and numbers. But that's probably where you'd want to first look.
David, do you think that the assessor will tell us what Tyler's revision?
They can. You can certainly make a request and say, look, we're trying to understand. We know a little bit about how land values develop. We'd like to know what adjustment factors you used with Cliff vis-a-vis factors that were used for the island, and how was Cliff differentiated, if at all. That's worth a request and see, given especially what he's told you.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, even if you think that adjustment isn't enough, you're going to have to come forward with market evidence and to show. And this is happening all across the city. Folks up on the Eastern Prom, Munjoy Hill, their values went up 4 times. Something 250 to over $1 million. And in part because sales up there have been through the roof. So that's why I said the first thing you do is you take that new mill rate, look what your valuation is, and see how you come out. All right. So go ahead.
I've got a bunch of questions
Yeah.
here, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any characteristics of the land that make it more or less valuable, like for a home, like numbers of bathrooms year-round? Are there any characteristics of land that make it more valuable, like a home?
Yeah. So when they do land valuation, there's topography. Topography. Is it flat? Is it not flat? Is there a view? Is there no view? Is it on a right-of-way? Is it on a street or is it on a right-of-way? What's the setback from the right-of-way? So they do look at the lot characteristics and make some adjustments. And again, if you looked at a reval sheet, there's probably 15 to get to your lot. They start here, and there's an adjustment, if any, for all these neighborhood, sub-neighborhood, topography, size, things like that. But again, it's all trying to add up to an indication of what value is. And just I didn't say this before, when I talk about value, Maine, the test is what's called just value, which is what a willing seller would pay a willing buyer under normal market conditions as of the date of valuation. And so the court is telling assessors, and there's been cases. There was a case in Scarborough that went on for years. This is when, you know, we don't remember it now, but at one point we had declining real estate values. It wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 12 years ago. And, you know, people would list a property at 1 million, and then they'd drop it to 900, drop it to 800, drop it to 700. Couldn't sell it. And that was 12 years ago. And a person had a property at 1.2 with a broker, listing and trying to sell it, trying to sell it, trying to sell it. Finally sold, you know, for 600 or whatever, and it was appraised at, or assessed at like $1.1 million. And the assessor refused to reduce the value to $650. So the poor person had to hire a lawyer, go up, and it had to go all the way to the Maine Supreme Court. The taxpayer lost before the Scarborough assessor, lost before the Scarborough Assessment Board review, lost in Superior Court, and it went up to the Maine Supreme Court 2 years later. And the court said, you know what, this is crazy. What we're trying to determine when we look at market value is what a property would sell for. That's what the property sold for. You know, you better have a good reason, and it was arm's length. Just because it's a declining market doesn't mean you throw out the value. You have to have a good reason to say you can't use this sale, and everyone agreed it was an arm's length sale. The guy had been trying to sell it forever. But it just shows you how difficult it can be to get a remedy where if you don't get it initially at the assessor's level. And that's the case that went up, but that dealt with declining values, you know. So that's the question on land. Yeah.
So looking at, I understand waterfront, non-waterfront, but you will see like over an acre of land that's valued less than like a quarter acre of land. And
Yeah.
so, and again, there, you know, if it's interior, not waterfront, why is there such disparity in?
So they're trying to, I'm not an appraiser or an assessor, so they're just trying to build a model they think is going, at the end of the day, is going to spit out something that's going to indicate what somebody would pay for the land. And so there's water view, there's waterfront, there's partial waterfront, and those adjustments they try to they code them to say, you know, somebody, there was an article in the paper, someone on Munjo Hill, they were assessed as if they had a water view. And they didn't. And the value, they called up and said, you're right, there's no water view. And they brought it down. And whoever typed in the characteristics of the property based on their walkthrough thought there was a water view. There was no.
How can you get that coding?
How do they, what?
How do you get that coding? That what you're.
Yeah, you'd have to, see, that's not available online, how they code it. And you know, what are they using for the multiples? But at the end of the day, remember, the burden at some point is on remember the monkey throwing the dart, and even if they miscode it, and they, you know, and then deal with it. It's important to try to figure that out and understand, because it may cause the assessor to say, you know, maybe you've got a point. Maybe we didn't adequately differentiate cliff. And this is not about waterfront versus water view versus non-waterfront. This is just you know, it's a base level. They start general, less general, more specific, and over here is waterfront, water view, non-waterfront. Up here is cliff, peaks, diamond, great, you know. And so that's coded as a neighborhood, I think. I haven't seen the data, but that's the way they do that. They would do it as a neighborhood code, and you wouldn't want to see the same neighborhood code for cliff that they use for peaks, because they're not the same. It's like they wouldn't have the same neighborhood code for Stroudwater they would for Munjo Hill, because if they did, my assessment would be sky high because of the land value, because of the values up there. Yeah. Let me just teach that hand.
Yeah. So it sounds like the city has decided, in concert with Tyler Technology, that they've done Cliff Island incorrect. And assuming those facts to be true, or that's safe to be true, are we getting shortchanged when they send out this new evaluation, and we're going to have to go right to a formal process instead of getting this other formal, informal review like many of us have done today? Or do we have I guess the bottom line is, does a person have a better chance of getting some type of adjustment by talking to, like
Yeah.
I did this morning for a neighbor,
Yeah.
talked to them, and they said, hey, yeah, you might have some points there.
It's a good question. The deadline to request an informal hearing is passed, that was it.
But they've said, we screwed up, we're gonna redo you. So we're starting from, basically, we're starting from scratch all over again. We're being denied that
No,
portion of due process.
I understand your point. I think it's more, you gotta have a way to get to the finish line. And so they don't wanna keep going back every time they make a correction. I mean, I understand your point. I think the reality is, I think the assessing office, even if you don't get an informal hearing, and even if you still have questions, they're gonna listen to you. They're gonna consider what you have.
Okay.
I don't think that they're saying, yep, you missed the informal hearing, we don't wanna hear a word you're gonna say. They're not doing that. And it would be suicide for them to do that, just from a public relations dealing with taxpayers approach. And I don't expect, the email that I saw, that Roger saw, and my understanding of how the assessor's office works. If you call and say, geez, I'm sorry I missed the informal hearing, I still have questions, I still have concerns, I think they're gonna listen to you. They're not gonna say, sorry, it's too late.
Okay. And the second part to my question, I'm gonna run over the email about looking at what our taxes would have been.
Yeah,
if
and I
things had
have,
changed. You wanna explain?
I have a number on my sheet on that.
Because they were gonna go out regardless of whether
Yeah,
I agree about it or not.
I added that to the bottom of my
Okay.
cheat sheet, so you could do that. What he's asking is that if your value had stayed the same and the city hadn't done the reval, based on what the mill rate would have to be to generate the $191 million budget that the city is budgeting for FY '22, what would your taxes be? So I put in this cheat sheet. I think the mill rate would be like $23.94 to generate $191.6 million. So if you wanted to take your old value and use a higher mill rate to come up with what would be needed for I put those numbers in the end of my cheat sheet, because Roger had passed that on to me, so I did that. Yes?
One of my questions has to do with the mill rate. If, say with your property, you said it went down a little. This year, we've had this influx of money from the government. They're gonna fund the schools 55% for the first time. There are all these other monies coming in. So I'm thinking that's not gonna last forever. Those are finite funds. So what we're looking at today might be a lot worse in a couple, 3 years when all that
Because the mill
comes out.
rate goes up.
It's gonna go up.
Right.
So in trying to calculate whether it's worth going through all this, that's something we wanna keep in mind, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think,
And I have another question.
again, I think that goes to a cost-benefit analysis, which is,
That's what I mean, yeah.
am I overvalued? And if so, by how much, and there's no guarantee, even if you get an appraisal and it's rock solid, that you're gonna prevail, because it's an opinion of value, but in my mind, if I'm overvalued, say by $2,000 a year now, on taxes-wise, property tax-wise, that's only gonna get bigger as you go further down the road. It would be part of the calculation I would do of whether I wanna hire an appraiser.
Right. And
But
do
I
you-
think that's where that goes. You're right, it's only gonna get magnified
Right.
as time goes on, but that's true for everybody in the city.
No, I know, but I think we need to take that into
Yeah.
account. This is an unusual year.
Yeah, that's a good,
Yeah.
yeah.
And the other thing is you keep saying a broker's letter or an appraiser, but it seems like you tend to favor the appraisal better. Is that worth more when you're going to your hearing, if you've had an appraisal versus a broker's letter?
Yeah, I mean, typically, and I can only speak for myself, you get an appraisal, and it's done as of April 1, and it's done specifically for property tax purposes. It carries some weight. I mean, sometimes in an ideal world, if you're sitting here now, it's March of 2022, 22 and you're having your appeal hearing at the Board of Assessment Review, ideally you'd like your appraiser to come and say, okay, I'd like you to come and speak to it and present it. And because the appraiser can, what they do is they'll defend their opinion. And some appraisers do a very good job of defending their opinion because at that point, the assessor hasn't bought into it. And so, you know, the assessor may have some issues with the appraisal or whatever, but if your appraiser's there, he or she can speak to and defend the appraisal. And again, Portland's good. You know, I've had situations where, you know, and I don't do a lot of residential because I tell people to get an appraisal first. And in communities like Portland, if you get a decent appraisal, you don't need me. Because the city, again, it usually means that something didn't get fixed. But in other communities, like in Gunflint, you know, I hire a really good appraisal. I get somebody with a beachfront property that's think they're way, way high, and he may be way, way high. And I get a great appraisal, and the guy says to me, you know, Dave, you know, just make sure you tell your client, I can be the best appraiser, but you're going in front of this board in this town. The chances of us getting an abatement are about this big. And just because it's a coastal town, and they think anybody who's got a beachfront property can pay whatever they can pay. And so you tell that to the client, and you go and do your best job, and they listen to you, and the assessor says whatever he or she says, and the board sits there like this. No, I vote to deny the abatement, and that's it.
Kelly, do you have more?
I do, yes. So someone had an appraisal done in November 2019 and January 2019. Do they need to be more recent?
Yeah, I would update them.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you have do you recommend an appraiser specifically for Cliff?
I don't know who, I don't know enough to know.
Also, if there are several folks who eventually want to do an appraisal, somebody has volunteered their house if the person needs to stay a couple days. Okay, so there's that.
Yeah.
I guess there was one more, I'm sorry. Somebody wants to know, would it be more effective for us to appeal as an island rather than one by one, as it seems that the land has been universally overvalued?
I would like to mention something about that.
You know, I think that going.
I didn't
If
hear
you're at
her.
the point where the tax bills.
I didn't hear that, what she said. What did she say?
I said.
She said, would it be more effective for people to appeal collectively than to appeal one by one?
It's like the Eastern Promenade's doing.
Yeah,
Oh.
you have to do your own individual appeal, but the more appeals that are coming, at least to the assessor's level, I mean, again, the formal hearing is before the Board of Appeals. So with the assessor, they're gonna talk to you on the phone. You know, it's still a little less formality at the assessor. I mean, if you have an appraisal, it's great to give it to the assessor, and maybe that'll do it. But I'm just saying, sometimes you gotta file an appeal, and you don't even have the appraisal yet, because it takes time. You can still file the appeal and just say, listen, you fill out a form, you say, listen, I think the land values are wrong. I think that, you know, it's a one-page sheet, and it's on the website, and it tells you what is your valuation, land and building, what do you think it should be? And a lot of people, if they think the building was done correctly, the square footage was done correctly, you say, I don't got an issue with the building value, I got an issue with the land value. I don't think this land value, I think, is way too high for Cliff Island. And, you know, if the assessor sees a lot of those coming in, and again, you've got to provide, at some point, you know, it's not just, you know, saying it, because just because we say it doesn't make it true. We all know that now. You've got to provide some credibility. But again, if one person is providing some credibility, you know that, you know, if you get you know, an appraiser who can, again, it would take some work, but somebody who looked at the reval adjustments, if any, that were made for Cliff, and could say, I don't think this makes any sense. Everybody who filed an appeal could use that as a, you know, detach it Exhibit A, here's what, Jill Smith said. I had a case years ago in Wells Beach where an appraiser who happened to own property on the beach, she spent hours, but she got all of the inputs, went through them, she got all of the land sales in the last 3 years, and was able to show with some credibility that the factors they were using weren't supported by the data that was in the town. But she did that, no one paid her to do that, but that information was used by everybody. And it helped. It showed there was a flaw. So long story short, everybody has to file their own appeal on a timely basis. And if there's support for the notion that the land value doesn't reflect the unique attributes of Cliff, they've got to somehow tied to one of the other islands. It may help, but again, you're going to need, at that point, you're going to need something to back it up.
Dave, Rachel here.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation yesterday afternoon with a gentleman at Tyler for over half an hour, and he was very informative. And one of the places that they are comparing us to that I thought was kind of odd was House Island. So that I thought was odd. It is part of Portland.
Okay, that's
Okay, so that was
because it was a sale.
but it is part of Portland. So he mentioned that. So that's something that was interesting. The other thing he said that exactly like so he agrees that there isn't enough data. There isn't enough sales, there aren't enough numbers to support any of us. But he did say just what that question was, that if we approach it as a community, that he said that's a really positive thing. And he also said, I said, well, I'm attending a meeting today, and he said, well, anybody from Tyler would have come to the meeting to chair. And I said, we are having another meeting next week, so I didn't know if that's something that,
Sure.
if maybe they'll tag along with the city of Portland, and because he said, we could, just to have them come along, because, he suggested that and I said, and he's like, and he started talking about like other islands. I said, Cliff Island isn't that kind of island. I said, we have no amenities. We're not attracting these $1 million sales. I said, it's a certain person that wants to. So he was sitting in the Gulf Coast. So he hasn't even seen, like these people who are doing this,
Right.
he's not even here. And I got the impression that they didn't even come to the island.
No, that's good. So maybe to build on that, if you, when I say you, I mean this collective group, it may be that the folks making these adjustments don't fully understand and appreciate the difference between Cliff and House.
Exactly.
Or the other islands. And maybe what you do is you get, I don't know if anybody knows a broker. Maybe a broker may be more effective than an appraiser, because you could maybe get it quicker and you can maybe work something out with a broker. But someone who does, there's a couple of brokerage houses that specialize in island sales, is to have them do a 2-page narrative and just say, listen, I've been asked by some folks in Cliff to explain, at least from my perspective, the market differences between Cliff and some of the other islands. And in fact, I was told that someone suggested that there were some commonalities between Cliff and House Island. So here's my letter. And then you have that letter. You can get that letter probably in 2 weeks. And you send that letter and say, listen, you've been asking us to give you information. We appreciate you being open-minded, but we really think you're missing the boat on some of these things. And to me, that's something that you could, again, we don't live in a perfect world, but with all your connections, if you've got a broker, someone who can do something like that, that would be great. I don't think you're going to get an appraiser to be able to do that, because appraisers can't give an opinion of value unless they do an appraisal. They'll lose their license. Brokers have a little bit more room to move. So that, building up on that conversation, that would be a good thing to do, because it sounds like they're struggling to understand.
And he said, we are setting aside every Cliff Island paper. He said, we're setting those all aside. So they know that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And, but but I thought, just if we got them out here, I said, we have dirt roads, we have no, I just, and it's like, yeah, that's not, that
Well,
doesn't.
The assessor admitted that this is the case. He
Yeah.
admitted that, he volunteered it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's Chris Huff, he'll be here next Tuesday. So I think it's a great idea if we can get a Tyler person here
He's
at
the
that
one who
meeting.
suggested it, yeah.
When is it on Tuesday, Rosie?
Yeah.
1:15 on Tuesday the 3rd, in this room. 1:15 next Tuesday, August 3rd.
Who can attend?
Anybody?
Well, the building, just on this point too, even if you can't get a broker, if you collectively can put a letter together and think about the qualities and characters that differentiate you from the other islands. You just mentioned dirt roads, et cetera, and just say, look, and have it come from, the Cliff Island Sustainability Committee. And just say, look,
Sustainable Cliff can do this.
it's become
Maybe
apparent,
tomorrow.
it's become apparent to us in our engagement with the city, which has been very helpful, and that it seems people don't really quite understand the difference between Cliff and some of the other islands. And here are 4 things, or whatever, that really differentiates us, and in terms of value, it impacts on value as well. How long it takes to commute, roads, whatever the factors are that would make it, clearly, if you're selling a house on Peaks, the market is much greater there.
He doesn't
More
know
so-
So if you had
With
just finish one thing, if you had a charge, you do that in the next week or so, draft something and have everybody, and that can be something that can be from the Cliff Island community, which would be asking for them to look at everybody at Cliff on that basis. So, your neighbor's not fighting against neighbor.
We will do
Going
that.
along with what
Right.
you're saying, more so than that, on the list, you spoke earlier about the value of, you have a buyer and the land could be only worth so much. Well, we have a limitation of we have X amount of land that you have, you can only go so high, you only have so much square footage you can deal with.
Yeah.
So these bombshells that were put on at Peaks Island and Diamond, they can't do it here. We're worth nothing. So they did buy over there, but they never would be able to
That
buy
would be something,
here.
again, to work into this.
Yeah. Second big part, we talked to Chris Kramer, and she wanted to know about, well, should I do appraisal or should I do broker? Well, in all the years that I've done real estate, people say, well, we're gonna get divorced. Oh, someone died. If you're gonna go into a court, you have to use an appraisal. It's worth nothing
Right.
if you use a broker. And if we're going to end up going to some type of court,
So,
it should be appraisal.
as I said earlier, you're not gonna get a day in court. You don't, the way the appeal process works in Maine, you don't get a day in court where a judge sits as a fact finder and decides any evidentiary issue. The only day you get for a hearing on where you can present facts is before the 3-person local board of assessment review. If it goes to court, the judge is only asking whether there was a misapplication of the law, or did the board make findings that were not based on any evidence in the record. It's extremely differential, and lawyers use the term de novo review versus appellate review. De novo review means it's a fresh start. You don't get a de novo review in the court system on residential appeals. You don't. And so your formal hearing, the only hearing you get at the end of the day is with the 3-person board of assessment review. And so when I say, just based on my experience having been on the board years ago, and every board's different as members come in and go off. We all bring our own different experience and thresholds. Right now, you would not get to the Cumberland County Board of Review. We've been wrestling with this issue, whether you have to have an appraisal or not. And the majority of the people on that board say that's unfair to the taxpayer. We'll listen to what the taxpayer has to say, and how credible, what facts are they relying upon. If they're just coming in and saying, I think I'm overvalued, blah, 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 but the notion that a taxpayer has to spend $1,000 to get an appraisal to challenge just to get in the door, the majority of the people on that board right now are not of that view. So you're right, if there was a court hearing on the issue of valuation and the court was sitting as a fact finder, you need an appraisal. And I'm suggesting to you, if you called me up and said I want to challenge it, as I just said, the first thing I'm going to say to you is get an appraisal. But at the level we were just talking about, I think it's worthwhile, again, the assessor is not at the point of fighting about values. The assessor's at the point of trying to understand if the factors they use, the garbage in, garbage out to come out with these numbers, whether those factors they used were approximately valid. And there's a question in the air right now, whether the land values that were used for Cliff were properly adjusted to reflect the difference between Cliff and some of the other communities. That's what the email that Roger forwarded to me seemed to acknowledge, and I think it opens the door right now, and especially in light of the comments you just made, to put together a letter in the next week or so that says, thank you, and listen, we're glad you're asking the same question we're asking to help you move along. Here is things that if you were out here, and you're welcome to come.
He did say one more thing that I wasn't going to mention, but he said it also has to do with our tone. And he said, as a group, if we come on the attack, they're going to shut down.
Yeah.
So he said, if we just present our facts and our story and just calmly, and he said, I said, I know we're just all very passionate about this subject. And he said, yeah, but if he said, as soon as you go on the attack, they're going to shut it down. So I was like, okay, that's great advice. So, but those are some of that was like the last
Anyway,
one.
so hearing what we're hearing,
Exactly.
So,
Yes, I was just gonna add another thing that we don't have. We don't happen to live here in the winter. For those that do, there's no store. I mean, this is a very basic.
We can put all that in the letter.
That's what I'm saying. This is the stuff that should go in a one-room schoolhouse, all this
right,
stuff.
and I've worked these things into a letter.
We'll
Absolutely.
do that. We'll draft one tomorrow, Friday.
I'll come to you, I'm just gonna, thank you for taking the,
Okay, two more questions. Any idea, estimate, how much the tax rate % will increase by, and will that be every year or 2 to 3 years?
taxes go up every year. And in Portland, they've been going up on average 3%. And that's mindful that Portland is one of the few communities in Maine that sees the overall property values increase because every year there are new buildings that are being finished. And you go down, when you take the ferry in, you look over at the East End waterfront.
We don't want them.
You're going to rise in tide. And you still go up 3%, but that's, they're going to go through.
Okay. And can you confirm that if we have our on-the-phone conversation with Tyler prior to all of this info being collected, will all of this also apply to us? I think they're saying if we have our conversation and some headway gets moved in their phone conversation, and then all of this happens, what everyone's talking about, will it apply to people who have a
So
phone
I can't say that with any, all I'm saying is based on the email that I read and the conversations that are happening, if in fact there's a recognition that there was the adjustment made for Cliff there wasn't one made, and it should be. That to me would mean it would be across the board because they're using a base land value. And before they get into the particular topography characteristics of your lot, waterfront, water view, non-waterfront, road, dirt road, driveway, they're still using a basic land value that they adjust for what they call a neighborhood or locale. And again, what you want to know is whether that maybe called something different, but I'm using the word neighborhood, and whether that is reflective of using the same factor for peaks that they're using for, or whether, but I think it comes back to there's some education, and there's a door opening, and based on that email, the conversation you and I had on the way over, there's a door that's opening, and you want to run through it as hard as you can, and it means extending an invitation, someone come out here. They need to be educated. And again, as I said, the assessor's office in Portland is trying to get it right. And they're not it's worthwhile trying to do it. You know, it's not banging your head against the wall where it would be in some other places. So,
So should they proceed with their calls, people who still have them scheduled?
Shouldn't
Yes.
they?
Yes.
yeah.
If they get people complaining repeatedly about the same thing, they're gonna hear that.
Yeah.
Especially if it's consistent.
Their website said unless you do this informal appeal, you can't do a formal one. You're saying different than that, but the Portland website says if you don't do the informal
We've
one,
gotta start and then
you
to
have
get
no
in the
Yeah.
door, right?
Yeah.
future action.
All right,
Is it
so
possible to make a Zoom meeting on Tuesday?
that's, the meeting on Tuesday, by the way, is the annual city fathers trip. They come down here for an hour. There'll be about 20 of them sitting around the room. And they just want to say, well, we've come. We know you're part of the city of Portland. All of us have been to these little charades before. So, but Rachel brings up a point, which I believe in completely, is if these people come down and we start yelling and screaming at them because of what Tower Technologies did, and they haven't corrected it yet, I don't know. Chris Huff, who is the city assessor, he's in charge of all of this. He hired Tower Technologies. I've talked to him. He sounds like a good guy. He volunteered that information that Tyler would be revising our land value. So